Welcome to this explainer. You ever stop and think about how a single, everyday action, like a simple prayer, actually carries the weight of a thousand-year-old logical framework? It is honestly mind-blowing to see how abstract principles of knowledge translate directly into physical actions. Today, we're diving into the mechanics of Islamic reasoning. We'll be drawing from a really fascinating set of source materials that map out this entire journey, literally from the philosophy of human thought all the way down to everyday practice. Let's get right into it. Here's a quick look at our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the foundations of logical reasoning, move right into the necessity of hadith, and then explore the science of preservation. After that, we'll unpack the tools of derivation before finally wrapping things up with the practical application in prayer. Section 1. Foundations of Logical Reasoning. To really get into this analysis, we have to start with the most basic question possible. How do we actually verify what we know? Before we can even begin to debate specific historical texts or rules, we need a baseline for the truth. According to our source text, the logic of reason is all about organizing the journey of human thought. You can't just take a random piece of information and jump straight to a final sweeping judgment. You have to pass through a really rigorous process. And the absolute first step in that process? Figuring out exactly where your information is coming from. And that brings us to a super strict hierarchy. Look, not all sources are created equal, right? Right at the top, we've got primary sources. Think direct observation or the original text itself. Step down one, and you have authenticated sources. These rely on collective transmission and consensus, basically a massive group of highly reliable people all agreeing on it. Then at the bottom, we have presumptive sources, like your single reports or individual accounts. So what's the big takeaway here? If you don't rank these sources properly, you are literally going to confuse absolute certainty with a mere guess. You absolutely cannot treat a presumptive, isolated report with the same weight as a collectively authenticated source. It just doesn't work that way. Section 2. The necessity of hadith. Okay, so how do these foundational rules apply directly to modern debates? Take the folks who claim to follow only the Quran, while completely rejecting the hadith, which are the recorded sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad. Our source material actually tackles this skepticism head-on, with a purely logical question drawn right from the Quran itself. The Quran mentions that God set a previous qibla, a direction of prayer, as a test, before changing it to Mecca. But here's the catch. If you look through the Quran, there is no prior verse commanding the believers to face that first direction. The source also brings up another verse where the Prophet promises his followers the backing of 3,000 angels. But again, nowhere in the Quran does God actually give the Prophet that specific heads up beforehand. So logically speaking, there absolutely had to be another source of revelation communicating those specifics to him. The text goes even further, pointing out the specific grammar in the Quranic phrase, obey Allah and obey the messenger. Notice that repetition? It doesn't just say, obey Allah and the messenger. Repeating the word obey grammatically establishes two entirely distinct types of obedience. Our source argues that if obeying the messenger was the exact same thing as obeying the Quran, that extra word would be completely redundant. And we know the text is far too precise for that. This points directly to an additional source of revelation called the hikmah, or wisdom, which is captured in those hadith. Section 3. The science of preservation. Now, if this secondary source is so crucial to understanding the primary source, how on earth do we know it was reliably preserved? How do we know it didn't just turn into a centuries-long game of historical telephone? Well, our sources show that the Islamic historical method demanded an insane level of scrutiny. Every single historical report is split right down the middle into two halves. You have the matan, which is the actual quote or action, and then you have the isnad, the continuous chain of narrators who passed it down. To even be considered an authenticated source, every single person in that chain had to have both strict moral uprightness and a flawlessly tested memory. If someone in the chain is unknown or they're known to be even slightly forgetful, the chain is broken and the report gets immediately downgraded. To give you an idea of just how intense this process was, our source shares this amazing historical anecdote. Imagine this. A scholar named Yahya bin Ma'in wanted to test another famous scholar, Al-Fadl bin Dukain, who is legendary for his memory. So Yahya deliberately scrambles the narrations. He's splicing different chains and texts together just to see if Al-Fadl would nod along and blindly agree. But nope. Al-Fadl instantly catches the errors and calls him out. This perfectly illustrates the brutal stress testing early scholars used to authenticate these chains. They weren't just taking people at their word. They were actively auditing their memories. Section 4. Tools of derivation.
So we have our verified sources, right? The Quran and the authenticated hadith. But what happens when we run into a totally new situation that isn't explicitly mentioned in those texts? Well, scholars bridge that gap using a strict sequence of 4 tools. First, you try analogy, extending an existing rule to a new case if they share the exact same underlying cause. But if using a strict analogy causes actual harm, you shift to equity, which is a departure guided by the overarching purpose. If it's a genuinely brand new situation with zero precedent, you look at public interest to find a verified benefit. And finally, there's blocking means, used to stop actions that might technically look okay but will foreseeably lead to harm. The key thing to notice here is the strict cascading hierarchy. You can't just skip down to a lower tool like public interest if a higher one, like analogy, already solves the puzzle. It keeps the whole reasoning system incredibly grounded.
Section 5, Practical Application in Prayer. All right, we finally reached the bottom of our funnel. How does all this intense logic, historical auditing, and deep derivation actually translate into your everyday physical movements? Let's take the daily prayer as an example. Our source manuscript anchors us in Maliki jurisprudence, which is one of the major schools of Islamic law. Now, the Maliki school heavily leans on the collective, authenticated Medinan practice as a primary source. Remember that hierarchy we talked about earlier? The Malikis argue that the continuous, collective, everyday practice of the thousands of people living in Medina, the actual city of the Prophet, acts as an authenticated collective transmission. So, mathematically speaking, it outranks a presumptive, isolated hadith report, even if that single report has a perfectly valid chain of narrators. Because of this specific logical prioritization, Imam Malik's rulings can sometimes look a bit unique. For instance, our source details that in the Maliki school, you only raise your hands at the very opening of the prayer, and you keep them down for the rest of the movements. Also, that opening phrase, the Bismillah, is often read completely silently or just omitted entirely in obligatory prayers. Now, sure, these might seem like minor details, but they are the direct physical result of that massive epistemological framework we just discussed, favoring a continuously acted upon collective tradition over an isolated singular report. The source manuscript also lists a bunch of other really practical rulings, like it's totally permissible to pray without a physical barrier in front of you if you're in a safe spot. If a gap opens up in the row ahead of you, you can literally just walk forward and fill it. Your gaze, it can stay naturally straight ahead. You don't have to force your head down. And your hands can just hang straight down by your sides, which is especially helpful during long periods of standing so you don't get fatigued. What I really love about this is the clear lack of rigid artificiality. It's not about stiff, robotic movements. It's all focused on internal humility and practical communal harmony. As we wrap up this explainer, just take a second to reflect on the unbelievable intellectual journey we've just unpacked. We started with the abstract logic of how to rank sources, moved to proving why we even need historical texts, looked at the rigorous auditing of human memory, and traced it all the way down to something as simple as whether your hands are raised or resting at your sides. It guarantees that the spiritual actions being performed today are built on an unshakable, heavily scrutinized foundation of truth. So, what does it mean to you, knowing that your simplest daily routine is actually the culmination of a 1,000-year-old science of reasoning?